it's time we got better at the really common spots in the game tree that are costing us tons of money unbeknownst to us. When you're playing low stakes, micro stakes, whatever it may be, you're playing 50 NL, let's say, the chances are that you have many holes in your game in very frequently recurring situations. Today, we're going to look at what it is to face a flop c-bet on a range bettable board. That's to say a board where pool will be betting range most of the time for a small sizing. And we're going to learn what the pitfalls are that many people playing a stake like 10 NL, 25 NL, 50 NL fall into, and how they're actually justifying a range bet strategy by not fighting back enough. We're also going to have a look at the turn, what happens there after you check raise the flop. We're going to have a look at what happens when you face turn barrels. We're just going to get better at defending this big blind range, because a lot of the opens that people make on the button are super loose. They're super like wide, weak hands, and therefore you have to defend the big blind very wide. And if you then overfold a lot post flop, you might actually be minus EV with the bottom of that defense range because you're not doing enough to bolster your EV after the flop. So let's see how we can fight back against range betting, take a stand, and learn to play real poker on the flop, because this is a common street and it really matters to win rate. Let's go. The flop we're going to look at right here is the king of spades, the 7 of hearts, and the 3 of diamonds. We are going to go ahead and check with everything. They are going to go ahead on the button and bet with everything. And we in the big blind are going to be faced with a dilemma already with lots of parts of our range. Some parts of this range are really easy to play. Okay, when you have 5 deuce of clubs, you're probably just going to fold, right? Right, guys? Right? Of course you are. But if you have a hand like ace-8 offsuit, ask yourself, what are you doing? Are you always calling or nearly always calling? Because I'll tell you something. When humans bet their range in this spot, you often overperform by defending. And that's because they don't do a great job at lower stakes of finding turn barrels with the less obvious parts of the bluffing range. And if you raise, you also start to overperform as well. So if we look at a hand here that's actually raising that looks deeply counterintuitive, which is the ace 5, that doesn't have the ace of clubs in it, right? So you have like one of the other aces that has the backdoor, let's say, or you don't have the 5 of clubs. You don't have a club, basically, right? So you're blocking more of your opponent's continues. These hands are pure continues on the flop. They're mixing call and raise. And if we click this strategy EV button here in PIO, sorry for those of you that use GTO Wizard, you can see that we are actually, winning with these hands at equilibrium. And although we're not winning much at equilibrium by raising these hands, in reality, we're going to overperform, because if you look at this from the opponent's point of view, this is their reaction now on the button to facing this raise. There are some hands in here, if you look at the bottom right of the screen, that are deeply counterintuitive to defend with, and a lot of people simply won't. You will have opponents that fold 10-8 of hearts every single time against a flop check raise, even though it's winning 3.67 chips, or in this 5-10 structure, that's a third, or 36% of a big blind. That's a lot of money in a small pot. That's a very reasonable amount of the pot, and your opponents are not finding these defenses. Other hands in here as well that people don't defend enough with, like ace 5 of clubs or ace 4 of clubs or something like that. People crave immediacy. They want to be able to hit their outs right away. They don't like just calling with an overcard to the board and some very flimsy showdown value, because the check raise is scary and it's intimidating, and it doesn't happen a lot at like 25 NL. So, maybe you're right to fold that hand to a check raise at 25 NL, but that's not the point, because we're looking at this from our point of view as the big blind, and now something like ace 5 should just become a pure check raise exploitatively. But that's not why we're even here today. We're here today to show you that the theory is different from what you think it is. So as a coach, I commonly see leaks like this. I see students send over their database and they've tagged some hand for review, and it's like a big, massive, exciting pot where there's like gunshots going off and tanks are blasting away and there's explosions. But actually, fireworks aside, there are plenty of hands that are just mundane, nitty-gritty scraps that go on all the time, the little small pots, the tactical skirmishes. And in these, you need to be on the right side of it overall to have a decent red line and a decent green line, right? So just be careful here that you're not folding hands that should continue at high frequencies, because those hands are probably doing really well in real life here. So let's say, for example, that you don't routinely fold a jack 8 of diamonds because you're not asleep and you've paid attention in this class, and you're now continuing with jack 8 of diamonds, and you call. And let's say the turn comes down something innocuous to start with, like a deuce, and you check with your jack 8 of diamonds and a fill in bets. Of course, your jack 8 of diamonds is now supposed to fold. And one thing that puts people off calling the flop with Jack 8 of diamonds and hands like that are winning calls at equilibrium and definitely winning in reality, is that they don't like the feeling of calling the flop and folding the turn. Because they're going to say something to themselves like, well, why did I call the flop just to fold here? That was a bad flop call. It was too loose. It was too spewy. It was, you know, when your thought process starts with two, T-O-O, two, it's probably too vague. See what I did there? It's probably a bad thought process, because who are you to deem what's too nitty, too splashy, too loose, too tight? Like if you're playing 50 NL or 25 NL, that's because you're not yet an end boss. You're not yet a poker god, and you don't know what's too tight. You don't know where the thresholds are yet in every spot. You've got some feel for it. You know, you're not playing 50 NL because you're clueless and you're a brand new player. I get it. But you don't have your thresholds down in every spot yet. I don't have my thresholds down in every spot yet. There's loads of spots where I'm like, oh man, I was a bit off there with the threshold, even though I've built a theoretical course that's all about, you know, what should be the case objectively in poker. So it's very easy here to just go wrong and have these thoughts lure you into delusion. So with the Jack 8 of diamonds, yeah, you're meant to be folding to the turn bet, but the thing is, look what villain's meant to be betting the turn with. While some of these bluffs are really easy to find, and people will bet the turn with something like 5-6 here, or 5-4 here, probably too much actually, according to the solver, too frequent. Not that that's like a problem, by the way, but their frequency will be higher. There'll be other hands in their range that they're simply not finding enough bluffs with. So if you look at the Jack 10 offsuit here, it doesn't matter what suit that Jack 10 is, whether you have a spade or not. You know, the spade is like going to make your hand slightly better probably, because your pair out will be more clean and you will block strong hands on the river and you will block some of the check raise bluffs. But overall, having two pair draws, two cards that are pair draws against the 7 or pocket 5s or something, is a building block of theory. It's a building block of GTO. And if you understand that lowest showdown value hands like Jack 10, Jack 9, 10 9, Queen 9, Queen 10 are barrels on the turn, as are some of these Ace of Spades overcard gut shot combos that are really high frequency, and even some hands like just Ace 6 with the Ace of Spades. Ace of Spades is a key card because it's the cleanest ace you can have. It's an overcard that's pretty much always going to be good, as long as your opponent doesn't have like two pair or something like that, right? It's going to give you the best hand really often, or a bigger ace, of course. But it's going to be super live because the Ace of Spades is impossible. It can't come when you have it, and so any ace you hit in the river will not bring a flush. But all of these nitty-gritty points that I'm getting into here, they really just go to say that there's a hell of a lot more hands in your toolkit here for barreling this turn, or there should be, than just draws. But your opponents are going to get bogged down in the weeds of just mainly betting their draws here at lower stakes. And because of that, the defense that you should be making on the flop that the solver says are meh, they're kind of optional. You know, take a hand like, let's see, the Jack 8 of diamonds. You should be defending that hand. It's gaining a little bit of EV. Now you definitely need to defend it or you lose a lot of EV, right? Try and find a hand that's like a mixed call fold here, like Queen 5 of Spades. The Queen 5 of Spades is break even at equilibrium, but you should either raise or call, and probably raise, but you know, call's an improvement on fold against the 25 NL pool, because they're not going to blast the turn at you with Jack 10, and then you get to just block bet the river or whatever you want to do and just clean house because they have too many air hands in their range. So a very nice exploit here is to take a hand like Queen 5, call the flop. They check back on the turn all the time with some hand like Jack 10 because they're just not playing aggressively enough. Some players will barrel, right? A lot won't. Not saying everybody suffers from this. And then on some river card, let's say the 6 of hearts, you have a really winning bluff because you've got here with a hand with no showdown value against the line that was actually bet and then check. So if we look at a hand here in our range, like the Jack 8 of diamonds, you can see that not bluffing would be an absolute catastrophe. And in real life, this is even more winning because your opponents are going to show up with too many combos of Jack 10 that are just folding to block. So a size like block that really aims to just get folds from the weaker stuff in villain's range. Ace high mixes fold against block on the river. There's a bunch of other stuff that has to pure fold. You know, if villain's getting here with way too many combos of Jack 10 and stuff like that, way more than this, then your block bet starts to overperform because there's just more hands like this in the range. The range is less protected. So when you look at what to do on the flop, you really need to trace it forward throughout the whole hand and ask yourself, sure, the solver says that it's break even for me to defend with like Queen 4, and I shouldn't do it all the time or I'm going to become too weak and I won't be able to handle turn barrels. And you can take that very defensive scared ethos if you want, but it's not going to do you any favors, because the real hungry, vulturous way to go about this, the way that will harvest the most EV for you, is to say, what's the case in equilibrium and what do I do in reality? Like, where do I move from that launch pad, right? Your launch pad here is that Queen 4 is indifferent. You should mix it against the c-bet. In real life, you can make an argument that continuing in some form is better than not continuing. So as an exercise, I'd go through a bunch of boards in GTO Wizard, PIO Solver, whatever you want to use, and find the clusters of hands that you're folding to range bets that you shouldn't be. I'm also going to show you now what happens on a slightly less good board for your opponent if they decide to bet range, right? So let's take a bit of a lower board that's slightly more connected. Nothing crazy, nothing that's like absolutely dreadful for them, but something where people might range bet even though it's not the main strategy in GTO. And we'll see what kind of fun we get to have there, because this is a whole new universe of defending flop. One of the reasons that I like PIO Solver is that I am an old man dinosaur. Not just an old man and not just a dinosaur, but like imagine a really old decrepit dinosaur that's just like walking around the, you know, in the prehistoric times eating palm tree leaves and stuff, like a big Diplodocus or something. That's me. But aside from that, I also like PIO Solver because it lets you lock villain to bet their whole range. So here we check villain bets everything on 9-4 deuce, and this won't be the strategy in GTO Wizard. It'll bet relatively often on this board. It might use a big bet, it might use a small bet, it might use 6,412 different sizings, which is not advised and is not helpful to learning and is dumb. But anyway, this is simple. And when we face this, we should do 26% raising. So if you think your opponent's range betting on 9-4 deuce, and a lot of your opponents will be at 50 NL and stuff like that, then you should be raising an absolute bunch. What kinds of hands would you fold here that you shouldn't fold against a range bet? Well, let's start scanning around the range. What looks like a really dubious hand that's pretty much always continuing? That's right, Queen Jack offsuit looks like a dubious hand. When you have that hand out of position against a flop C bet, you may look at that and go, meh, I don't like it. It's not very good. And you'd be right, only you're getting very good pot odds. You're getting 4-1, your opponent bet third pot. If you have 20% of the pot here in your share, if your share of the pot's 20% of the pot, then you're doing okay here. You can actually continue, rake aside for now. And whether you should raise or whether you should call is going to depend on the pool that you're against. But at most micro stakes pools, again, raising is going to be really good because the defense task is even harder now for your opponent, because they've just bet a board with everything that you shouldn't bet with everything. So now when you look at the opponent's defense strategy, it's going to be pretty difficult, right? Like, okay, you're allowed to fold certain hands here, but you have to call with like King Queen of Hearts and King Queen of Spades and stuff like that at some frequency. King Queen offsuit has to call every time it has a club. Queen Jack has to call every time it has a club. It's just easy to overfold to check raise if you don't know what you're doing. If you do know what you're doing, it's not that easy to overfold to check raise on this particular board. But when you're not studied and you're just simplifying to range bet without knowing what comes next, and you're getting away with it because you're playing against a pool that doesn't raise you a lot, you can go really wrong here. So I think it's really important just to note that some of the raises you make here and calls that you make here are going to feel grim. They're going to feel like they're bad hands and you're really not excited to be calling with them at all. So next time that you're in this spot with the King Jack of Hearts and you face third pot on this board, you have to remember that it's a big mistake actually to fold. 1.44 chips here, which is what you'd be losing by not calling this hand, is enough of the pot to matter in this kind of situation. Remember there was like a big feud on Twitter a while back with Matt Berkey and Jonathan Little, and it was something about like how it doesn't matter whether you lose 1.44 chips. It wasn't exactly this number in this spot, but I think Matt Berkey's point was that this is quite meaningful because the pot is only several big blinds here, so losing 1.4 chips or 14% of a big blind really does add up, given that you play this spot all the time. It was something to that effect, right? The feud, the dispute, whatever it was, the micro drama. These dramas come and go like the wind in poker these days. But it was something to that effect. And I think that's right. I think that you need to be very careful here, getting these flop defense right. I want to take a look now at defending against the turn, right? So let's say that you call King Jack. And a lot of the time when I'm coaching, my students will object in the following way. I'll say, you've got to call that hand. And they'll say, but I don't know what to do on the turn. And I'll say, that doesn't matter. And they'll say, what? How can it not matter that I don't know how to play the turn? I'll be like, you don't know lots of things in poker. Like, even the best players around still don't know lots of things about this game. This game is like an immensely complicated beast, right? So you're not just going to know what to do in every future node. But if Equilibrium tells you that you should call King Jack, remember your opponents have to not screw up the next street as well. They have to know what they're doing also. And if you're playing 50 NL, they're not poker monsters, you know? They're not like end bosses. So they're also going to make mistakes. So it doesn't actually matter how many mistakes you make later. You can go wrong and you can be confused as long as on average you're not making considerably more than your opponents. And I think this was also part of the Jonathan Little versus Mac Berkey thing that happened on Twitter a month ago or 2 months ago or whenever, but something to that effect. So I wouldn't worry about that. I wouldn't worry about what you do on the turn, but do try to get better at it. So let's set you a puzzle, right? What if the turn is the 4 of diamonds? It pairs the board, it's really dry, but it doesn't hit your pair. And you have the King Jack of hearts and you face like a big bet there. Are you going to be able to call? Are you going to be able to raise? Are you going to just have to fold on 9 of diamonds, 4 of clubs, 2 of clubs, 4 of spades or something like that? Well, my prediction, and I think it's always good to do this before you go to the next node and just read the solver. Anybody can read a solver. My prediction for this would be that King Jack isn't as far away from a call as you might think. And the reason for that would be that you have really good pair draw and your king high is showdown value actually against a bunch of villains range. I don't think that's the kind of combo you'd be raising, although I've been proved wrong many times by a solver for not being aggressive enough in nodes like that. But I think call and fold are going to be pretty close there, and I don't think it's going to matter that much what you do. That's my guess about this spot. Let's see if I'm actually right against like a normal sizing. Okay, so it's not a million miles away from a call. It is a fold, and you are actually allowed to mix a little bit of raise. Wow, it shows what I know. So yeah, the pair draw equity here is like so good. Like the pair draws are so nutty and so powerful that you're actually allowed to turn this into a bluff raise at some frequency. If you call with King Jack of hearts in the turn, you're losing 0.86 of a big blind in a pot that's, sorry, no, you're losing 0.086 of a big blind because you're losing 0.86 chips. This is a 5-10 game, so that's like less than 1 chip. A big blind is 10 chips. So you're not losing that much by calling in theory, but you are meant to fold. And again, that's okay. Like, it's okay to call the flop and fold the turn with this hand, because when you just judge yourself harshly based on a thought process like, oh man, it sucks to call and then just fold to a bet, you're forgetting about the times the turn checks through. You're forgetting about the times you hit the turn. You're forgetting about the times you hit the river after the turn checks through. You're forgetting about the times you just bluff the river with a lot of fold equity on some cards or show down on the river in some other spots because your hand is still just good enough to show down. So all in all, going back to this node where you face a tiny investment on the flop but you're getting 4-1, you should be calling the King Jack of hearts, because although usually you lose the pot and not that much is going your way, enough is going your way that you can call for this price, especially against humans. And that's the mindset you have to have on the flop. You have to have this sort of, it sucks to put money in here, but it's better than not attitude. And that's how we're going to get good at poker. We're going to understand that we don't need to feel comfortable to do things. Another big problem with poker players when they're starting out or they're struggling at micro stakes is that they want to feel good all the time. Because poker is a game that hits you with pain and pleasure and rewards you and punishes you relentlessly and is always, you know, throwing you around on that roller coaster, you want to feel good. And you can get stuck in this like hedonic mindset where you want your next emotion to be a positive one. But actually, you just have to accept that you can flick in a c-bet with King Jack of hearts and fold the turn and it's just on to the next hand. And you did a good job there. Not many people pat themselves on the back for calling the King Jack of hearts and then folding to a turn bet. But more of us should, truly. Okay, this time we've defended the big blind and the flop is Queen of Spades, 10 of Spades, 3 of Hearts, and we are going to face a c-bet once again. This time the solver isn't range betting, although most humans will. It's betting 70% of the time though, so quite a lot. And I want to look at the node where we check raise as a bluff, right? Because we're going to do some check raise bluffing here, and their main check raises are going to be flush draws, they're going to be straight draws, and they're going to be a few other weird looking hybrid hands. A hybrid hand in Carrot Poker School is a hand that can get called by worse, has good improvability to win a big pot, and can get some better hands to fold and gets protection. So it's like kind of a mixed bag of different reasons for wanting to raise. And we introduced that fairly early in grade 1 when we talk about the mixed bag rule, which is that on flop, you can make some raises that are a little bit non-standard looking because there are multiple things driving the EV of raise here. So 5-3 is an example of a hybrid. What are some other hands you might be bluffing with here? Something like 9-8 suited backdoor. This is a very weird hybrid, by the way, 10-6, which is raising for all kinds of different reasons. It's the most vulnerable sort of 10. It can probably improve to some okay stuff, like 10-6 is a fairly live 2-pair. It doesn't bring any straights, for example, and it does clean up some equity when an overcard or whatever folds, although 2 overcards won't fold very often at all. So yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff going on, but let's say we do raise the flop, right, with that range, and we get to the turn, and the turn is a brick. How would you expect us to need to play the turn in that spot when the turn is a 5 of clubs? So the board is queen of spades, 10 of spades, 3 of hearts, 5 of clubs. What are you going to do on the turn when you've raised the flop? With a draw, with a flush draw, king 7 of spades, what are you going to do? Vote now. Well, the way this kind of blank turn, I would predict, will play out is that we mostly just want to be using very big sizes for value when we have pocket 3s or queen 10 or something like that. We have check raised the flop with some queen X, so it's possible we have a smaller size as well on this node because we have some of that top pair stuff going on. But for the most part, we're going to be giving up with the bottom of our range, bluffing the high equity stuff, and using some really big sizes with our nutted stuff. That would be my guess here. So we're going for the B75 here, the bigger bet. Okay, we don't use the overbet so much, but we're going for the bigger bet here with a range that looks like queen jack plus a bit of queen 9 actually. In fact, all kinds of queen X are slotting into this range for betting the turn because this turn is so dry, it's preserving their equity, preserving their EV. And in general, when we have a draw, we're going to be bluffing a lot, right? So if we look at a hand like king 5, that's going to be bluffing king 3, that's going to be bluffing king deuce, that's going to be bluffing. Nut flush draws are going to be bluffing. But the thing is here that we get here with so many draws and we brick this turn really hard that our EV here as the out of position player is 116 chips. And when you turn on the EV view here, you can see that these dark green hands that make up the bulk of this EV are pretty rare. So it's not that we have massive EV here because we have a lot of equity. Our equity is only 47% range versus range. But the reason we have 116 chips out of 217, which is more than half the pot in EV, is that our nut advantage is extremely strong and we have a ton of really nutty hands. But what that means is that because we have quite a lot of bad hands here as well, these flush draws, now that they've not hit, have gone down significantly in value, and our lower equity bluffs are just kind of trashy now. If you look at a hand like the 9-8 of hearts, it's worth almost none of the pot whatsoever. And when you have the bottom of your range on a node like this, you do just need to give up. That's something we talk about in grade 3 of the Carrot Poker School, that sort of turn play after check raising flop. So it's really the nutty hands that are driving the EV of your range. And what that means is that you need to be a little bit careful with what you bluff. So there is a real minimum quota now that's more severe than it was on the flop about what kinds of hands you need to bluff. So even with a hand like Jack 9, you can see that the solver's saying, well, I'm actually going to be checking this hand like pretty often, because if I bet all the time, I'm just grossly over bluffing. So you'll actually find that your human opponents on a brick turn over bluff because they've raised loads of draws on the flop and they just don't have the value to support always blasting with their draws. So while like your best flush draws, your nut flush draws, these low cards that unblock the folding range presumably or have the extra pair draw are always going for it. You see there's a lot of giving up here going on with the weaker flush draws. Like the Jack 6 of spades is now just demoted to check folding, and that's deeply counterintuitive. So the main rule for these brick turns is that although your range is doing okay in EV, it's only because you have a big nut advantage and you have more concentration around pocket 3s or queen 10 or something. It's not because your range can just afford to bet all the time. If you change the turn card though, and we make it like let's say a card that doesn't complete ace king, because that's a very unique monopoly hand for the imposition player, but let's say we make it the 9 of diamonds. So it's queen of spades, 10 of spades, 3 of hearts, 9 of diamonds. This is a situation where when we turn on the EV view, we now notice a few more kind of good to medium hands. So like the queen 10 that we're raising on flop, that now becomes like a good to mediocre hand. we'll still see that many of our draws are not great, but they're a bit better now. The pot share number is higher. They've got a gut shot and stuff like that. So this turn is a bit more merging to our range. It's a bit more of a blending kind of turn. But it is a situation where, again, you know, we're going to be able to barrel the gut shot plus flush draw now. But if you go down to the bottom of the range and you look at something like the two very low cards with the flush draw, they're just giving up. They're just check folding on this node. So I guess turn play after check raising is about understanding which of your hands still have enough EV and equity to be blasting in theory and which ones don't, and going from there, because this isn't like a totally difficult spot for your opponent to defend or anything. You know, if you bet this turn card, your opponent's got a fairly easy time. They can just fold their very worst top pair, and then everything else, it's like pair plus draw, nut flush draw, etc. It's just going to be able to continue. So if anything, you might find people call too wide here because they call top pair again or something like that. So this is not a spot you want to have a field day with, but on flop, you probably do. So the main way to play exploitatively as the big blind facing like this small c-bet is to be pretty aggressive on flop, but once you're called, understand that this might no longer be a situation where you can just freely bet any draw that you raise the flop with, and you're going to have some standards, and it's no longer going to be such an overfolded spot. So the main things I'd say in summary for this video are: look for counterintuitive wide defends, both with calling and raising against the pool. So just look for those weak looking hands that are still too good to fold and work on your thresholds. Thresholds is the key word. Learn where they are on different textures against frequent small betting. Secondly, remember that your opponents have to barrel the turn quite a lot with counterintuitive hands that they may not do at low stakes and micro stakes. Look to take advantage of that by defending the flop wider and bluffing rivers, especially for a small sizing that cleans up against air. And thirdly, when you do check raise the flop, although that can be a nice exploit right there, we talk about that in Cash Injection, episode 1 is all about that exploit, it can run out quite quickly on the next node, especially if your opponent's called the flop too tight, and then they have to make some like top pair laydowns on the turn. You might find that your worst draws there are just spewing to invest more money with, and you have to have that standard. Alright guys, I hope this has been a useful exercise. Sorry if it's a little bit technical for you, but thank you if you've watched all the way to the end. You will definitely have gotten something useful out of this video. And if you say so in the comments, we can do more of this. If you say so in the comments, we can do less of this. Let us know what you think. And, you know, stay tuned to Carrot Corner for all of your poker, cash game, training needs. See you later. Bye for now.